Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon, Alina. Thank you for joining us. Others will be joining us as we go over this next few minutes. Welcome to this inaugural lecture in a new series sponsored by Daisy Alliance. Daisy Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit organization focused on broadening education and awareness on the risk posed by nuclear weapons, with an emphasis on bridging the gap between today's youth and the older generations. We approach nuclear weapons policy through an intersectional lens rather than the traditional national security lens. Our mission is to reframe public discourse on nuclear weapons by emphasizing the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear war, promoting the global anti-nuclear norm, and broadening the definition of national security to include human security. Our work challenges existing national security frameworks by examining the consequences of nuclear arsenals on vulnerable populations and the inherent racism, sexism, and legacies of colonialism in nuclear and security policies. Daisy Alliance aims to build a new generation of public officials dedicated to changing the way we view security and the role of nuclear weapons in providing that security. Again, this is our inaugural lecture, and our featured speaker is Dr. Martin Hellman. You have his bio, so I'll just highlight a few things. He is Professor Emeritus of Electrical Engineering at Stanford University. A statement of support for his current project on rethinking national security has been signed by former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, among many others. Martin and his wife wrote a book on creating true love at home and peace on the planet that former Secretary of Defense William Perry said should be read by married couples seeking peace at home, as well as by diplomats seeking peace in the world. How profound. So if you've registered for the lecture, we have your contact information, and very soon we'll be sending information on upcoming lectures. We have lectures planned already through January of 2023. So just very quickly on some housekeeping matters, please keep yourself on mute and type any questions in the chat box, and we'll make sure to keep up with that and respond to those questions. So without further ado, I turn over the session to Dr. Martin Hellman.
Well, thank you, Greg. And I've been active with Daisy Alliance for a number of years, starting with Bruce Roth, who's since passed away. And I think it's really important to have a group in the Southeast where you're primarily located that works on this. It's needed everywhere, but I think the Southeast is particularly important. I'm going to start with an Einstein quote that many of you may be familiar with. I think he said in 1946, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking. It's changed everything except the way we think, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." There's a flip side to that quote, and that is, if we would adopt a new mode of thinking appropriate for the nuclear age, we could not only avoid unparalleled catastrophe, we could build a world that we could be proud to pass on to the next generation. And that's really what motivates me. I'm pulled by that vision much more than I'm pushed by the threat. But how bad is the threat? Because that's what's really going to push most of society to wake up and hopefully be pulled by the vision. In a paper in March 2021, so roughly 18 months ago, I estimated that the risk of a major nuclear war was approximately 1% a year, which meant that we're playing Russian roulette with the whole world about once every 15 years. Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, whom Greg quoted just a few minutes ago, told me that he agreed with that estimate. And by the way, not only is he a former Secretary of Defense, he has a PhD in mathematics, so he understands numbers. Bill told me that he agrees with the 1% per year estimate. And when I asked him if I could quote him on that, he said, yes, I could. And so now that was before the war in Ukraine started. Compare that to society's perspective, even with the war in Ukraine raging, there's an attitude of nothing that bad could possibly happen. Now, I'm going to encourage people to read the paper, and I did send Holly a reading list for anyone who wants to delve into more detail, and I assume she'll be sending that. In fact, I know she'll be sending that to the participants. Now, by the way, people who say that a nuclear war is not likely are probably right, because I just said that even before the war in Ukraine, we were like playing Russian roulette once every 15 years with the whole world. In Russian roulette, there are 5 chances out of 6 that you don't get killed. You probably won't die in Russian roulette, and yet none of us would play Russian roulette. And why are we doing it with the whole world, much less repeatedly? Today, with the war in Ukraine, it's hard to say exactly how much, in fact, you couldn't say before exactly what the risk was, but you can do it approximately. I've estimated that the war in Ukraine certainly has increased the risk of a major nuclear war. And I think it's more like 1% per month right now. To put that in terms that the average person can understand, that's roughly equivalent to playing Russian roulette with the whole world once every year that this war drags on. Very dangerous. By the way, that's in addition to the horrendous human toll in Ukraine, and Russians are getting killed as well as Ukrainians. This is just a horrible, horrible situation, and we need to bring it to a conclusion as rapidly as possible on as reasonable terms as possible, both to avoid Ukraine being totally destroyed, bled to death, and also to try to reduce the nuclear risk. Well, what can we do? We can't allow Russian aggression to succeed, but we also can't risk destruction of our nation. We're between a rock and a hard place. And the best time to have stopped this war was before it started. And that is almost always true. Most wars don't happen just out of the blue. They are a sequence of accident change where one side makes a mistake and the other reciprocates with another mistake. And you suddenly find yourself on the brink of nuclear disaster, as we did in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm going to turn it, well, is the light, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Is the lighting okay here? Do I need to turn a light on, Greg? Okay, good. So could we have stopped this war before it started? Well, I can't be sure. I don't know. I mean, I can't be 100% sure, but I'm going to give you a really interesting data point that's incontrovertible that I came across about 2 months ago. A poll done by the University of Chicago with the Ukrainian affiliate in Ukraine in June of this year, so several months into the war, found that 58% of the Ukrainians polled place at least some of the responsibility for this war on the United States. Let me read this, tell you that again. 58% of the Ukrainians polled say the United States is either significantly to blame or bears some responsibility for the war. Now, 85% say that about Russia. So I agree with them. Russia is most responsible for this war, but we are not blameless, nor is the Ukrainian government. In that same poll, 70% of the Ukrainians polled say their own government bears either significant or some responsibility for the war. Now, I won't go into why that is right now, but in the Q&A, if people have questions, I can tell you why I think that is. That was not one of the questions. By the way, I did call the University of Chicago. I was able to locate one of the lead researchers on that poll, and I checked with her to make sure it was accurate. It was sponsored by the Wall Street Journal. It has not been reported by the Wall Street Journal, probably because they didn't like the results. I can't be sure on that. And what she told me was that the major bias that they could not remove is they were not able to get as many Ukrainians living in Russian-occupied territories as they wanted because they worked from Ukrainian cell phone numbers. And in the Russian-occupied territories, they now have primarily Russian cell phones. So if anything, that makes the poll more pro-Ukrainian than the average Ukrainian. And so, again, this is not to justify what Putin has done in Ukraine, but it is to say that we have some responsibility. And there's good news there. The book that Greg mentioned, that my wife and I wrote, has a story in it many, many years ago. My wife and I had a huge argument. And by the way, we haven't had a fight in almost 20 years now. So, which was beyond my wildest uh, possibilities. I have to give Dorothy, my wife, the credit for that vision. But we had a huge fight maybe 30, 35 years ago. And I went into the living room licking my wounds. And I remember feeling it was all this crazy woman's fault. Well, then I realized if I was right, I was powerless to get out of the pain that I was in. But if I was wrong, if I could find something that I had done to help start the fight, that is, I had some responsibility in addition to what I was seeing her having done, then I could apologize for that. And that could start a process that might lead to reconciliation. With that motivation, I was able to see something that I had done to help start the fight, which in hindsight is ridiculous. Of course, it takes two to fight. And I went in and I apologized to her, feeling heard for the first time. She then apologized to me for mistreating me, and the whole thing just evaporated. Now, I'm not saying that would happen between Russia and the United States, but we need to start a process in which we stop seeing this as Russia's fault, end of story. Yes, Russia has significant responsibility for this war, but we are not totally clean, nor is the Ukrainian government. By the way, I first became aware of Ukraine as a potential flashpoint in October 2013. That was 5 months before the Maidan revolution, or the Russians see it as a coup. And how did that happen? There was a new postdoc at Stanford. Actually, he was a pre-doc. So you people know what a pre-doc is. I can use that term. And he asked me what I did. And I said, well, I look for accident chains that could lead to nuclear war. I look for crises before they're crises, before most people even realize we need to be paying attention to them. And he told me I should look at Sevastopol 2017. And I had no idea what he was talking about, but I very quickly, in a little research, found that I knew that Sevastopol was the Russian Black Sea port, their warm water port. And what I did not know was that they had a lease on Sevastopol from Ukraine that lasted until 2017. Yanukovych, first of all, Tymoshenko, when she was prime minister of Ukraine in, I think it was 2010, had said that there was no way she would extend the lease on Sevastopol. Yanukovych, in the meantime, had been elected president of Ukraine, a somewhat more pro-Russian perspective. He had extended the lease, but I could see what my friend meant. If a new government came to power, as happened with the Maidan revolution, it might threaten Russia's Black Sea port. And there was no way Russia was going to put up with that any more than we would put up with San Diego possibly being lost as a US naval base. And so while I didn't think it was not right for Putin to seize Crimea, I had some understanding of why he did it, because Sevastopol is a part of Crimea. And so in the same way, if we will pay attention to China, to North Korea, to Iran, I think we can avoid wars there that otherwise will surprise us much as the Ukrainian war has. And not only is there horrendous nuclear risk, there's tremendous human toll being taken and tremendous destruction within Ukraine. Well, while it's too late to avoid a war in Ukraine, what can be done now? Well, quiet diplomacy is needed, because in the current understandably emotional environment, no one can speak rationally about Ukraine, either here in Ukraine or in Russia. In fact, it's illegal in both Ukraine and Russia, from what I can tell. But key things that I see that will be needed is NATO membership for Ukraine. We need to admit that it's never going to happen, at least not in the foreseeable future. Germany and France will, maybe now with the war that things have changed, but before the war, there's no way Britain or France were going to allow Ukraine into NATO. It didn't meet the requirements for NATO membership. So to the extent that this war is being fought over NATO expansion into Ukraine, it's a non-issue really, or it was a non-issue. The Minsk agreements, imperfect as they were, need to be used as in my conviction, as a starting point. And both sides need to adhere to the Minsk agreements, but neither side was doing a very good job of this. Another thing we need to deal with is corruption in Ukraine. It's a horribly corrupt country, as is Russia. And we need to stop pretending that Russia's corrupt and Ukraine is fine. Yulia Tymoshenko, the former prime minister of Ukraine, has and I have this is in the, I'm pretty sure it's in the reading list I sent to Holly that the participants can get. Yulia Tymoshenko has alleged that Naftogaz, which is the Ukrainian state-owned natural gas company, is trying to embezzle $8 billion US. Doesn't mean it's true, but it's possible. And so we need to be careful about sending tens of billions of dollars of aid to Ukraine without making sure that it's actually getting where it needs to go. And I have some thoughts on that I've posted, but I won't go into here. Most critically, the three things we need to do to avoid the war to minimize the risk of the war in Ukraine continuing and blowing up in our faces as a nuclear war. First of all, be as objective as possible. We need to stop seeing this as Russia's fault, and that's the end of the story. Russia is most responsible for the war, as the 85% of the Ukrainians said in the poll. But there's plenty of blame to go around. Both the Ukrainian government and the United States and NATO and the right-wing militias in Ukraine are all involved. Another thing in being as objective as possible, we need to recognize, just as I did, that Dorothy, even though she was behaving crazily from my point of view in that argument I talked about, that even though Putin is behaving in horribly crazy ways, he does have some valid points. 46 ethnic Russians were burned alive in Odessa in May of 2014 as Ukrainian nationalists surrounded them, singing the Ukrainian national anthem and chanting basically "Burn, Russians, burn." Now, Putin has killed far more people than 46. So this does not justify what he's done, but we need to recognize that as a fact and recognize that something needs to be done to prevent repetitions of that. Also, of course, ethnic Russians have killed Ukrainian nationalists. And so this ethnic conflict has got to stop. Another thing that we need to recognize to be as objective as possible, in 2019, 40 members of the US Congress tried to get the Azov Battalion declared a foreign terrorist organization. The Azov Battalion, now known as the Azov Regiment, was defending the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. That was not usually stated, but they have Nazi roots, and that needs to be dealt with. There's a reason 40 members of Congress tried to get it declared a foreign terrorist organization. By the way, Putin also has neo-Nazis fighting for him. War brings out the best in a nation and the worst, and that's happening on both sides. So that's be as objective as possible. The next thing we need to do is define our goals as clearly as possible. President Biden defined our goal as regime change in Russia. I mean, he has tried to walk it back, but I think you're all familiar with his statement that this man, meaning Putin, cannot stay in power. Well, what is the risk of this thing going nuclear? Will the Russians stand for that? Speaker of the House Pelosi, when she was in Ukraine, said, "We're in this until Kyiv wins." What is the probability of that happening? It actually is looking more possible now than before, but with the huge amount of weapons that we're providing Ukraine. But it still is a unlikely possibility, and especially Russia, I do not believe, and Putin will not put up with that, and we're likely to see a nuclear war as a result. Lloyd Austin said that our goal was to neuter Russia. Now, he didn't use those terms. What he said was our goal was to weaken Russia to the point that it can't do anything like this again. Well, imagine if the Russian president had said after the Iraq invasion that their goal was to weaken America so it can't do anything like this again. And you can argue about whether Iraq and Ukraine are comparable or not. More people have died in Iraq than in Ukraine. Both wars were illegal. And President Bush, the man who started the Iraq war, in a slip of the tongue or a Freudian slip, said several months ago, one man started this illegal, brutal war in Ukraine. And so it's something that we need to look at. If Putin is guilty of war crimes, which I believe he is, the question becomes to what extent America is also guilty of war crimes in other parts of the world. Coming back to defining our goals as clearly as possible, which of those goals are achievable? what are the costs of trying to achieve them? What are the costs to Ukraine? Let's not bleed Ukraine dry. What are the costs to the poor people in the world who can't get grain to eat? I mean, push food prices up. And perhaps most fundamentally, what is the effect of those various goals on the level of nuclear risk that our nation bears along with the rest of the world? Lastly, with Ukraine, we need to bring this war to a conclusion as rapidly as possible. Ukraine is bleeding, more people in poor nations are going hungry, and there's an elevated risk of our nation being destroyed in a nuclear war. How to bring it to a conclusion as rapidly as possible is very difficult. It's easy to start a war, it's hard to stop it. And I think we're going to have to work really hard at doing this. But the three goals I've just enumerated, be as objective as possible, define our goals as clearly as possible, and bring the war to a conclusion as rapidly as possible are essential. Let me turn now more generally to the Rethinking National Security project that I have, and which Greg mentioned, and former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta is one of the signatories on the statement of support. The statement starts off by noting, and this precedes the Ukrainian war, of course, in 1945, when World War II ended, the United States was absolutely secure from attack. No one could touch us. Since then, we've invested vast sums trying to improve our national security, with the paradoxical result that today the United States can be destroyed in under an hour in a war with Russia, for example, if Ukraine blows up. And then the statement goes on to ask, is it possible in this age of nuclear weapons, pandemics, cyber attacks, terrorism, and global environmental crises, is it possible that national security is becoming inseparable from the global security of all nations? And if so, how do our policies need to change? I'm convinced, as I believe the signers of the statement are, that we need to find a way to make all nations in the world secure, which means not only making Russia feel secure, but making Ukraine feel secure. We can't, I mean, Ukraine is not yet a nuclear power, but when this war is over, it will be strongly incentivized to seek a nuclear arsenal. So we need to really look at this, and we need to move beyond the simplified narrative that we tend to subscribe to. Here I have time for just a couple of questions that are raised in a report or paper, which Holly will send the link to all of you. The first one is, does our nuclear umbrella provide protection? Is it a nuclear umbrella? Well, when I was teaching a seminar on this at Stanford about 6-7 years ago, one of the students, Katie Farron from Great Britain, said, maybe the nuclear umbrella is made of tin foil, and it's very protective in a rain shower, but it can turn deadly in a lightning storm. I think that's a good way to look at it. Along the same lines, Dorothy, my wife, pointed out that whoever came up with the term nuclear deterrence was a marketing genius, because it implies that nuclear deterrence deters. Imagine if they called it nuclear chicken, which is another way of looking at it, in which it can too easily morph into. Another question, there are a dozen in the report, is the United States the world's sole remaining superpower? We hear that said so often, that we are the world's sole remaining superpower, that you can't help but believe it to some extent. And yet, Russia has over 6,000 nuclear weapons. We have about 6,000. So we are not the world's sole remaining superpower. We are the world's sole conventional superpower. And that's a true statement. But what's the advantage and what is the risk of being the sole conventional superpower in the world in a nuclear armed world? Important question to be asking. And what I say in the report is we need to be treating other nations with respect before they have nuclear weapons, instead of waiting until they do. And so Ukraine, for example, needs respect. But we also do not treat even nations with nuclear weapons with much respect, as you can see with North Korea, and with respect even to Russia right now. Let me emphasize that while I've been talking about nuclear weapons, the solution to these problems is not nuclear disarmament. And that's a key thing. Most people who focus on nuclear weapons are focused on nuclear disarmament. But let's imagine for the moment that we had a magic wand and could wave it and make all nuclear weapons in the world disappear right now, but nothing else changes. Well, that wouldn't make the world safe, because a race would ensue of all those nations that knew how to make nuclear weapons to reconstitute their arsenals before the others did. And whoever got there first would be sorely tempted to use its temporary nuclear monopoly before the other nations had weapons. So just getting rid of the weapons is not the solution. It's important to recognize that. We need to, I'm going to show you a picture here. Share screen. Oh, wait a second. That won't work. We'll get rid of that. Let me bring up a preview. Now I can do it. Share screen. You see that diagram? Give me a thumbs up if you do, Greg. I think you do. Okay, this is a diagram that shows three superstates. The central state is the world as we know it. And until the war in Ukraine, we were somewhere in the middle of that superstate. That is, the state being a condition of the world. And there are two thresholds. The nuclear threshold on the right, to the right, is what the first time a nuclear weapon is used in anger. And we have never crossed that threshold since the United States lost its nuclear monopoly. We came dangerously close 60 years ago in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're getting dangerously close today. So you can see how these disasters occur step at a time. We don't just go from the middle of the world as we know it, superstate, to the edge near where we are now. It's a sequence of mistakes on different sides. In the same way, the solution to the problem will not occur as a discontinuous jump. We need to move in the other direction, in the safer direction, by building trust in a process that occurs step at a time. I've defined an intermediate goal of 1,000 warheads worldwide. There are currently about 13,000, so we have a long ways to go. But so the nice thing about 1,000 warheads, for better or worse, is it would still allow nuclear deterrence. Nobody would dare start a nuclear war, a war with a nuclear armed adversary if they had several hundred nuclear weapons. And yet it would take a fundamental change in our thinking to get there. Once we've crossed that threshold, we need to continue working until we reach what I call a state of acceptable risk. Notice I don't call it nuclear disarmament. I don't call it world peace. I don't call it world government. Different people have advocated all of those different approaches, and some mixture of them may be required, but it's better to call it a state of acceptable risk, because it's easy to argue against world governments. It's easy to argue against nuclear disarmament. It's easy to argue against any of the other specific solutions. It's very difficult to argue against seeking a state of acceptable risk. So again, to summarize, let me get rid of that. The solution is not nuclear disarmament. It's a process of change. We need a process that starts, and it doesn't just start with getting rid of weapons. It starts with better foreign policy. The idea of the accident chains comes up there. Let me get rid of this. Move this over. And we won't have better foreign policy until the citizens of this country demand it, until the citizens of other countries demand it. So that's us. And the statement, the idea that you need to think globally, act locally, is very so true. And the book that Dorothy and I wrote is a good place to start. Read, it's available as a free PDF. It's something you can do in your everyday life. And the link for that is in what I sent Holly, and she will send to you. Read the first story, which takes all of a minute. If you like it, and I think you'll recognize yourself in the story. Dorothy gets so mad at me 35 years ago that she rips a map out of my hands. And of course, being 35 years ago, it's a paper map. She rips it to shreds and throws it all over the car. And I had done absolutely nothing to deserve this, mind you, at least in my mind at the time. Now I can see what I'd done. Fortunately, the story ends with both of us laughing. If you relate to that story, read more. If you don't, just get rid of the PDF, you'll have lost nothing. Whoops. Well, I'm going to stop here and take questions. But again, the best place to start is in your personal relations, because you will see immediate benefit there. Whereas I can't point to one war that I've stopped, I can't point to one nuclear weapon that I've gotten rid of, but my life is infinitely better because my wife and I no longer fight. And I'd encourage you, whether you don't have to be married, by the way. Bill Perry, when he said married couples, I would change that to just couples, or people in the workplace can benefit from it. So let me stop there and we'll go to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Marty. A great reminder that the trouble just doesn't happen. It's a process, and your work and your efforts and consistency in that message. It's a great reminder, and that we all have important roles to play. So again, for guests, just post your questions in the chat room, and we'll read them as we receive them. So the first question is, should the Ukraine conflict extend into winter and heating fuel becomes insufficient, as we know it will, how do you think Western Europe and the world will react?
It's anybody's guess. Chuck, that was Chuck Powell asking that question. It's going to be a mess. I mean, that's one of the things that we need to recognize, that when you get into a war, really bad things happen. And bad things, not only people getting killed, but like the Iraq War, I spoke with an Iraq veteran who still suffers from PTSD, not from what happened to him in the war, but from what he did. He ended the conversation by saying, I was an accomplice to murder. I won't go into the details. And in the same way, if Europe starts freezing this winter, I don't know what we're going to do. And I only hope that we come to our senses and start saying, well, what Putin did was illegal. While it was a war crime, it was not that unusual in this world in which we live. Other nations have done similar things for which we do not prosecute them. And we're going to need to decide, are we going to prosecute everybody, or are we going to have a do-over and figure out how to not have things like this happen again? If anybody wants to ask a question verbally, that's also okay with me. We're a small enough group.
Sure.
Just unmute yourself.
Well, I'll jump in while others are thinking and formulating questions in their mind, perhaps. There are two things, Marty. As somebody who I teach a course on a graduate seminar on foreign policy and international organization. And since this crisis in Ukraine jumped off, and now it really does seem to be dragging on. I have two concerns, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. First, that we, the world community, is becoming resigned to this is going to drag on for a while, and that's okay. Just keep arming, keep supporting Ukraine. I wonder what you think of that mindset. And then secondly, that this is more and more approaching a direct confrontation between the US/NATO and Russia. At a point, when is the US and NATO a co-combatant?
Actually, there's a simple answer there, Greg. We already are. We helped sink the Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. What would we have done if during the Syrian war, the Russians had given intelligence to the Syrians that allowed them to sink an American ship of comparable size? Very dangerous situation. And there are a number of articles that make the point that we are effectively at war with Russia, even with just being, in fact, I just saw an article. It's no longer Ukraine fighting a war with NATO weapons. It's NATO and the United States fighting a war with Ukrainian blood.
And so then at a point, the Russians have to conclude that we are in fact at war. The two sides are in fact at war, and so I worry about what might the Russian response be. They at a point they have to respond with war action to this.
Yeah, no, it's horribly dangerous, and there's no, as I said, there's no good solution right now. I think we need to give Putin a face-saving exit, which no one wants to do. Everyone wants to humiliate him. But remember what happened when we humiliated Germany in 1919 at the Treaty of Versailles. We laid the conditions that allowed Hitler to come to power, producing World War II. And coming to your first question, if Ukraine if against all odds, Ukraine should actually become victorious in this war, what's likely to happen or look like it's about to win the war. Cornering a mad dog is a really stupid thing to do. Cornering a mad dog with nuclear weapons is even stupider. And that's what you would have done. What we would have done.
If I may ask a question real quick as well, I'm curious as to what the potential consequence could be of maybe a smaller escalation, perhaps Russia uses biological weapons. Could that perhaps provoke a stronger nuclear response in relation of where that is done and the damage is done, if it's attacking civilians and things of that nature? Could that lead to nuclear confrontation or tension?
Yes, it definitely could. By the way, I should mention that there was an article in the Atlantic magazine. I didn't include this in the reading list, but if you wanted, I can send it to you. Maybe two months ago, it was in June, 3 months ago, I guess, by Eric Schlosser, the author of Command and Control, in which he quotes Bill Perry. He did an interview with Bill Perry, and Bill said that he thought that the risk of the use of a single nuclear weapon in Ukraine was greater than during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which he was a direct participant. Now, he thinks it would end with one weapon, but I'll come back to that in a second. He thinks it would be an ultra low yield weapon used against a purely military target. There would be an outcry, but he thinks that might be the end of it. He's probably right, but probably is an inadequate assurance, just like there are 5 chances in 6 that you survive Russian roulette, but even one nuclear bullet in a 6-chambered gun is too much for me. And in that same Atlantic article, Scott Sagan, the noted political scientist here at Stanford, says separately that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon, the United States should do one of several actions: attacking Russian troops in Ukraine, sinking ships in the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, or maybe even attacking targets in Russia from which we believe the attack emanated. Any one of those is likely to escalate. Yeah, I mean, this is that diagram that I showed you before. Let me bring it up. Wait a second. Preview. Here it is. Share screen. That it's how you end up on the nuclear abyss and crossing over. Thank you for that question.
So yeah, I have another question, and I agree with you about not eliminating all nuclear weapons. I think there's so many systemic aspects for the other types of warfare and the likelihood. I mean, some people argue that this Ukraine war wouldn't have happened had Ukraine not given their weapons up with the non-Lugar thing. I guess my big question is, you set that number at 1,000, and I think about, nuclear winter takes 100, according to many studies. So how do you propose, or I don't know if you've gotten this far, how do you propose the distribution of those 1,000?
That to be negotiated, but roughly speaking, I'd expect a couple of hundred would go to the United States, a couple of hundred would go to Russia, maybe 100 or possibly an equal number to China, France and Britain. I mean, it really doesn't matter. This is the other thing. In Rethinking National Security, there's a question that I raised of how many nuclear weapons do we need to land on an adversary, be able to land on an adversary to deter them? Kennedy was deterred during the Cuban Missile Crisis from striking the Soviet missiles on Cuba out of fear that even 1 or 2 of them would be operational and hit Miami, take out Miami or DC. You can see where he would be deterred by that. Well, if he was deterred by fear that even 1 or 2 might take out a major American city, how many do we need to be able to land on Russia, on China, on North Korea to deter them? Do we need 6,000 or more nuclear weapons? I don't think so. Do we need 600? I don't think so. But we're not going to get the numbers down there without a fundamental rethinking of national security. But one other thing, the reason I call it rethinking national security, not thinking human security, not thinking global security, is most people start with national security. That's where most Americans are. That's where most people in the world are. Starting with national security does not confront them the way dealing with talking about human security or global security does. You end up there starting with national security. You end up in the same place, and it's a much more effective way to go, in my opinion.
Marty, what are your thoughts on the security of our nuclear power plants of the world, and coming out of this crisis in Ukraine? What else should we think about doing? I would think that we need to have a discussion that looks at securing these installations and not allowing things to get to a point where we're fighting wars around them.
Good, very good question, Rick. I'm glad you asked that. One of the things that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant confrontation has made me realize is you might be able to have nuclear power in a peaceful world. You might be able to have war in a world without nuclear power plants, but you cannot have both. Because in fact, Frank von Hippel, the physics professor at Princeton, who has an international security center there, he started it. I don't think he's still in charge of it. He's getting old. But Frank told me about a year ago that every nation that has nuclear power plants is a Chernobyl waiting to happen. All an adversary has to do is hit the nuclear power plant with precision-guided conventional weapons, and they effectively had a nuclear war. You don't need nuclear weapons to be a nuclear power. But the other thing I should say here is that the fundamental problem is not nuclear weapons or climate change or any of the other technological problems that we're facing. Those are all symptoms of a deeper underlying problem. And for this, I sent this to Holly, I was honored to deliver an address to the annual meeting of Nobel laureates 3 years ago. And I encourage people to watch that video. It's a half-hour long. It's on the technological imperative for ethical evolution. It's how technology is forcing us to become more ethical. It's not just morally desirable, it's necessary for human survival. And in it, I say that the real problem is not nuclear weapons or climate change or any of these other things. It's the chasm between the godlike physical power that technology has given us and our at best irresponsible adolescent behavior as a species. Humanity, I argue, is like a 16-year-old kid with a new driver's license who somehow gets his hands on a 500 horsepower Ferrari. We're either going to grow up really fast or we're going to kill ourselves. And so that's even before Zaporizhzhia. When people asked me about nuclear power, am I for or against it? I knew I'd lose half the audience either way. And so I give a different answer, which is actually where I am. Whether you're for or against nuclear power, everyone is against having irresponsible 16-year-olds run a nuclear power plant. You might have a responsible 50-year-old running the nuclear power plant, but the corporate management over him still has quarter-to-quarter mentality. It's an irresponsible adolescent behavior. And at Fukushima, the responsible, roughly 50-year-old nuclear power plant manager flooded Fukushima with seawater against orders from his management at TEPCO. Very un-Japanese of him to do that. Thank God he did. They were trying to save a multi-billion-dollar nuclear power plant, which he knew was already toast, and waiting to flood it with seawater just would have made things worse. But that's a good example.
Thank you.
So again, I totally agree with you about this aspect of technology being ethical, age appropriate for us, and it will either save us or it's going to finish the job. We're going to do one of two things. There's a great Bradley quote on this as well at the end of World War II. But I guess my other question, and this is pretty much conjecture, but I'm curious to hear, knowing the Russians' proclivity to adopt a strongman leadership, say Putin, whether he's ill or whether he gets taken out, what do you think happens then if there's a change in leadership? Do you think they're just going to go with somebody, another oligarch, or what do you think will happen?
Some of the articles I've read, I'm not sure about them, but they indicate that Putin is actually one of the more moderates within Russia. And so if he's taken out, it's likely there's a chance that they will actually be confronted with someone worse, just as happened in Iraq and Libya and other parts of the world. We think regime change is the solution, and yet if we look at the history of regime change by America, it is not a good one. And why we'd expect different results in Russia or North Korea when we had such bad results elsewhere is something that I question, and we need more evidence before we try regime change.
Kiran, go ahead. I see your hand, I believe.
Yes, thank you. So going back to the automation question, I was actually thinking about something along those same lines as well. With the arrival of artificial intelligence and the fact that a lot of weapon systems are now so precise and so fast that humans cannot operate them, they have to be done with AI. Does that, do you think, increase or perhaps decrease the chance of a nuclear weapon being used? And also, I don't know if this is detracting from the overall conversation or not, but this is also a curiosity of mine and how it might relate to this. With the expansion of space exploration, including the militarization of space, do you think that will play a role at all, or the possibility of nuclear weapons in space, and what effect that could possibly have for national security and global security now and moving forward?
Yeah. So you asked whether the short response times are helping or hurting. I think they're doing both. And it depends on the situation. We don't know which one it's going to be. Clearly, if we give over responsibility for launching wars, much less nuclear wars, to technology, it's a very dangerous situation. I mean, we've had a lot of technological problems in the past. On the other hand, as I studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were several incidents I didn't have time to go into, but there were false alarms of a new radar system that showed a Soviet missile had left Cuba and was about to land on Florida within 2 minutes. And by the time that they were ready to take any action, they knew it was a false alarm because 2 minutes had passed. So it's possible that the short response times might actually help, because would anybody in his right mind dare start a nuclear war with just a minute or two to make the decision? It could go either way. But all of this is pushing us to become more thoughtful and avoid getting into these situations in the first place, so we're not between a rock and a hard place. And so just as we make these mistakes step by step, we need to have a reverse accident chain that moves in the other direction step by step. We need to build trust a piece at a time. So for example, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, was far from perfect, but it was a starting point from which we could then build toward a better relations with Iran, which were quite possible, in my opinion. Not with the Ayatollahs necessarily, but an Iranian American friend of mine told me that if the Ayatollahs were to try to enforce their laws within Tehran, there would be a revolution. The young people just wouldn't put up with it.
And I think we lost Kiran.
I think we did. It's getting also.
Yeah. Alina, our guest, do you have any questions for Dr. Hellman?
I don't have any questions, but thank you so much. It was very informative.
Yeah, and by the way, I noticed from your name, it looks Slavic. I'm not sure which side of this you're on. I hope that I presented a balanced view, although anything balanced appears in the current environment to be one-sided to each side in the conflict. I hope you've been here long enough that you could see it, see both perspectives.
Yes, I'm from Russia, but yes, you provided a very balanced perspective. Some aspects which we discussed back at home were mentioned. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, should we draw it to a close, Greg, or is there?
I think that's a great idea. So Alina, and I'll get with Kiran. Kiran and I actually worked together in the state chapter of the United Nations Association, the UNA. And so we talk about these and other issues, you know, on regular occasions. I want to thank you, Alina, for checking in. Again, the DAISY Alliance, which was founded by our dear friend, the late Bruce Roth, is committed to educating, advocating, and encouraging people and helping people to get engaged and involved on nuclear issues. So please do keep up with us. Check out our new website. There are areas that are still being rebuilt, but do reach out, and we definitely will keep you apprised of future lectures and activities. And same for you, Kiran. And so thank you for checking in. We all do have to act local, and while we're thinking globally. So thank you for checking in, and we'll be in touch regarding the future lectures. October, November, December, and January, we actually have lectures planned. So we'll be in touch with more details.